So yeah, I'm Eric Smith. I'm a unit chief at the Bureau of Justice Statistics. I have been for about the last 6 years heavily involved with an initiative to grow the number of law enforcement agencies that report incident-based crime data to the FBI. So I saved that for last because that's the one that I'm most jazzed for you guys to hear about and to understand what kind of data will be collected and what we're trying to do with the information and et cetera. But I do want to talk a little bit about the other data sources that the Department of Justice has that can speak to gun violence. So I believe that many of you will already be familiar with these data sources, but I do want to talk a little bit about, show a little bit of the information that we've actually published in the past and try to get some ideas out there about how the information can be used a little bit differently, maybe in ways that as a federal statistical agency, we are not able to examine the data, but that you all may be able to. So hopefully that's, my goal is to provide that information so that we can have that conversation, if not during this discussion, then later on in the day when we have the roundtable sessions in the afternoon. So a little bit of a summary about what Bjs does, for those of you who are maybe not as familiar with our mission. We're the statistical arm of the Department of Justice. We have a very broad legislative authorization to collect data across the justice system, broadly on crime and the administration of justice. We do have a pretty small staff, and I think right now we're, ladies, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're only at about 30 statisticians to cover the entire mission, and I think the agency is at about 55 staff total in terms of everyone there to support the publication of all these statistics as well. So we, in terms of the broad base of our mission, we cover everything from collections on victimization to law enforcement, police recorded crime, information from the court systems, corrections, all the way through recidivism data. So we do have statistical units that cover all of that work. We also are in charge of the Prison Rape Elimination Act data collection implementation, as well as responsible for collecting data on tribal justice, also across the entirety of tribal justice. So I'm not going to get into all of that, but anyone who has questions about that afterwards, always feel free to follow up with me. Not a problem. Well, that didn't work. There we go. So I'm going to jump right into the data sources. I'm going to cover some information about the National Crime Victimization Survey, talk a little bit about the work that the FBI has done over many, many years at this point, collecting supplementary homicide reports data, discuss a bit about our survey of prison inmates. We did just recently release our first report from an updated version of that survey. We haven't done it terribly often, but this is our third iteration of the survey of prison inmates. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the National Incident-Based Reporting System that is also collected by the FBI. So in terms of the NCVS data, we are lucky, I think, right now to have two statisticians from BJS who work very intimately with the data. They're both experts on the NCVS data. So if I mess anything up, please let me know. Or if you have anything that you want to add, please jump into about any of the information that I present. So as some of you may know, the NCVS is an annual data collection that looks at criminal victimization in households in the U.S., measuring victimization of persons age 12 or older who live in the households. It is the second largest household survey in the federal government, next to, or just behind, I guess, the ACS. So it's large, it's ongoing, it's our major source of victimization information, both reported and not reported to the police. Collects information on non-fatal criminal victimization. I have included here some of the various crime types. This is not meant to be exhaustive, but looking at rape and sexual assault, robbery, general assault, and then larceny, burglary, motor vehicle theft, etc. But the heart of the data collection, I believe, is all of the ancillary information that's collected that you can use to understand crime in its context a little bit more broadly. You can also use the data to generate household and person level estimates of prevalence, which we have been doing more of over the past several years and looking to examine how robust those measures are over time. And of course, you can generate information about firearms violence, otherwise I wouldn't probably be talking about it this morning. So I've pulled one of the restrictions that I have on what I can show you is that I can really only provide to you information that's been published in the past. So some of the actual data I'm going to show you will look a little bit dated, but the whole idea was to just give a general understanding of what we have published and to talk a little bit more about that. So one of the key items that you can generate from the NCVS, I guess, is looking at trends over time, including not just counts, but population-based rates. So the NCVS does, as part of the data collection, also have a population file that is used to generate these rates. And one of the important things that we've been working on recently is the ability to generate state-level estimates. 22 states, I think, is the total that we have boosted sample across the country in 22 states. And so we hope to be able to release those data at some point in the future where it's a little bit up in the air exactly when that information will be validated and available for sort of general research and public consumption. But we are trying to get down to lower levels of geography. The NCVS is really our only point of reference in the country for unreported data, especially on this scale. And so to be able to look at that information at lower levels of geography, both at the state level, at the large MSA level, will be really important for the research field, we believe. And even if it's information that we are not able to do some of the more intricate and more sophisticated analyses that you all may be able to do, that's part of why we were motivated to provide this information out to the public. We've also been able to use the information to look at these trends at various different time points. One of our goals for moving forward in the future over the next couple of years is to update this kind of information. I apologize how the color doesn't show up very well here in terms of being able to look at the differences, and you can see the actual estimated estimates through the bars. But the whole point of this type of analysis was to look at gun violence at 2 different points in time to see if we're seeing any changes in trends across various demographic categories. So one of the nice things will be that moving forward, we're going to be able to take this analysis and look at not just breaking this out by males and females, but also layering in race into the mix and seeing if we see any differences there. So what this slide is basically showing is, that we're not seeing a lot of change in gun violence. I think it's empirical support for what we all seem to know is happening. And I would be interested to see that when we layer in the newer years of data, if we're not actually going to see an uptick. I'm not really sure at this point, but that is something that we would want to be able to take a look at. In terms of additional information about non-fatal gun violence, this comes from one of our more recent criminal victimization reports. I just took the data and sort of looked at it a little bit differently in chart format. But what you're seeing is that while we're seeing an increase in non-fatal firearm violence in terms of the number of incidents and victimizations, we're seeing a decrease right now in the percentage of those victimizations that are actually being reported to police. So being able to unpack that information a little bit more is something that we can do with these data, and that we can also layer on potentially other sources of information to try to understand what may be driving that phenomenon, and then looking at it over time to try to understand, is this a blip in the data, or is this something that we're going to see as an ongoing trend in terms of the decrease in reporting? What you're going to see in this next slide is I was hoping no one was looking at it too closely, but I'm just going to call it out. I am saying here that the percentage of the percentage of firearm violence that was reported is about 56%, and you're going to see a different number here for various reasons that I could go into some other time. But this is to illustrate that not only can we know the percentage by year of firearm violence that's not reported, we can also look at those reasons for not reporting. That's broadly true in the NCVS, and I know that Janet, I think that you'll talk a little bit more about these type of data in your presentation later this morning. But it is one of the critical items that you can pull out of the NCVS. What is this motivation, and how does that differ by not only offense type, but some of these various characteristics of the offense as well, and the incident as it occurred to the victim. So I'm going to turn now to talking a little bit about the data that's collected by the FBI in the supplementary homicide reports. So these data have been collected for, I think, since sometime in the 60s. I don't know the exact date, and I know that there was a methodology change around 1980, and so we generally at BJS tend to work with the data from 1980 and beyond because the data are more comparable from that point forward. This is the FBI's, for the longest time, it was the FBI's only incident-based data collection that collected data on a national scale, and actually still is, because NISS is still in the development phase in terms of getting enough agencies on board to generate national estimates. These data are part of the FBI's UCR program. And it collects data from about 90% of all homicide incidents that are known to law enforcement annually. The one real benefit to the SHR data that the FBI collects is that you can get down to these lower levels of geography, and they're already coded into the data set. The information is provided by the Census Bureau, so that information is validated. It can be connected to other census data sets very easily. It can be connected to units of local government, so you can pull in all these other ancillary data sources should you want to do that type of research. And then this is also the data set that, in terms of incident information from law enforcement agencies on a broad scale, provides a lot of context about what occurred during the homicide. Weapon use, location of the incident, information about the victim and the offender, and most importantly, victim-offender relationships. You can start to unpack what's really going on in the incident. So we have in the past, again, a little bit of dated publication data, but we have examined this information in the past and published on it. You can look at firearm use, and you can break that down a little bit by firearm type. It's not as detailed as we may want. And hopefully that will change over time as more incident data are collected by the FBI more broadly. But one of the benefits here is that you're able to generate population-based estimates of firearm violence and of homicide more broadly. And you can disaggregate these rates by various victim characteristics. So for instance, here we just broke it out, very simple breakout by male and female. But there are all sorts of things that you can do with these data to look at those disaggregated characteristics a little bit more closely. So for instance, here we wanted to know, was there a difference across white male, white female, black female homicide rates at two different points in time? Some of the nuance that gets lost by me just sort of popping this into a slide as opposed to having the greater context within the report is that you see these trend lines where you're looking at individual age here on the x-axis, and what we were able to explain in the report is the magnitude of the difference between these lines. It's actually much larger than it looks when you just graph it out onto the graphs. So what you see here is that white males were the only demographic category that had a decrease in the percentage of homicides that involved a firearm across the two different time periods. For the other three race and gender combinations, we saw nearly this, we didn't see any change over time. I should say here too, that one thing that we have not done with these data, and I'm not 100% certain how far down into lower levels of geography we could go before we lose a number of cases, but you can, with the data, as I mentioned, it's already got all this geographic information coded onto the file. You can examine these patterns over time by state, MSA, county, federal judicial district. All that information is already available in the data. And you can pull in all sorts of different correlates connected to those particular units of geography or units of government, depending on what you're looking at, like poverty, disparity scores, education levels, et cetera. So we did take a look at this information. Hopefully this shows through in some decent fashion up on the screen, but we did take a look at this information by community type. And what we did see at the time, and again, it's one of these things we want to go back and re-examine to see if we're seeing the same trends, if we're seeing something different. We set a 0 point for the homicide rate, and then looked at things looked at firearm homicide by the type of area. So we've got rural areas, suburban, and then 3 different city size measures. And we see a fairly dramatic decrease in the overall homicide rate in large cities. But what we see is that the percentage of homicides involving a firearm in all those places was relatively unchanged. So we're seeing a decrease in the number of people who are dying by homicide during this time period, but how they're dying is remaining relatively stable in terms of firearm use. One of the things that would be interesting, I think perhaps Chief Loon will talk a little bit about the type of information that Chicago has on this front, but is taking a look at how you could examine this information, if not by individual law enforcement ORI, you could take a look at it by county and try to see where things fall within county by the various ORIs that report. There are 90% of all the homicides in the country are reported to this data set. And the key critical missing component is Florida. So a lot of that 10% is going to be in Florida and then sort of dispersed throughout the country. So you won't be missing a lot of reporting information by county if you were to aggregate at that level. I know of real interest is information about mass homicides, and that's a little bit difficult to define. It's a little bit difficult to get good data on mass homicides without doing a lot of, across the country, without doing some specific searches on, not that primary data collection is necessarily a problem, but going out and getting a lot of information about what's been published in newspapers and sort of collecting information that way. But one of the ways that the government has taken a look at mass homicides, and I believe some research has been done by the Congressional Research Service on this front and a few other government agencies, is taking data from both the CDC and from the CDC and from the SHR and saying we're going to define mass homicide as any incident that involves 4 or more victims and use that as our benchmark for examining the phenomenon of mass homicide on an annual basis. And so taking a look at the SHR data from that standpoint, we wanted to see what kind of guns were used in these incidents. And what you do see is that there is an increase in what is coded as other gun as the number of victims in the incident actually increases. And other gun, that category includes automatic weapons. My recollection of the data, and I would have to verify this, is that you cannot break out just automatic weapon use within the data right now. It's already aggregated at the point that the FBI publishes it. And so that would be a question of whether moving forward in the future, that's something that we can look at and track separately and maybe facilitate some sort of change to the data collection structure to get that information at a more granular level.
Excuse me, can I just have one quick question?
Sure.
Did you say what year these data represent?
This is going to be from 2011. So yeah, so I apologize that I'm just unable, because we haven't updated the data and published it that way, that I'm not able to show you something more recent, but.
Just any given year, this could be skewed by a Las Vegas or something like that could totally change.
Absolutely,
year, so.
Yeah. Well, and so one of the critical like benefits, I guess, of the way the data are collected is you can find those incidents. For better or for worse, you can find them. So that's a disclosure review problem in and of itself. But the way the FBI UCR data are collected, the assumption is with the way the technical specifications are written, the disclosure review is sort of assumed to not be a problem. So it benefits researchers. It may, moving forward, be an issue, but right now, all that information is available. You can pull out that ORI and look at those incidents. So for instance, in 2008, you can very easily identify, 2007, 2007, right?
clarify, the
Yeah.
ORI is the
I'm sorry,
law
thank you.
enforcement agency unique identifier.
Yes,
So if you see
thank you.
a particular ORI, you can look up and see that it's the Las Vegas
Right.
NPD.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, technically, automatic weapons, that's, you mean a machine gun? Or do you mean a semi-automatic?
I believe that it includes both of those categories. I would have to pull up the definitions that are included in the technical specification for the data collection.
Again, automatic weapons were banned a long time ago. So I'm just curious.
So I think I'm wondering more whether it includes automatic weapons. My assumption is it's like fully automatic weapons. I know it includes semi-automatic weapons. So that's my error for just the way that I wrote it on the slide there. Yes, for certain. But you can go into I think it's, I don't know if it's 2007 or 2008. You can find the Virginia Tech shooting, for instance, because you can find the agency and you can look at across those incidents that were reported by that particular agency. You can find all 33 victims of the Virginia Tech shooting.
Is there any sort of hate crime left?
In the SHR data, no. But there is in the Ncvs data, which we'll talk a little bit more about. There's not just a flag for hate crimes in Ncvs. There's the hate crime data collection that's conducted by the FBI is subsumed under the Ncvs data collection. So all that information is available at the incident level.
Question about, I'm trying to actually understand what the denominator is for the percentage here. That's not incident, that's actually the total individuals killed.
In a single incident, yes.
So if you have one incident, that overwhelms all the rest. I think, is that great, is that your point? I forget who asked. I'm sorry, but
Daniel's
it's
point
you.
that-
John's, yeah.
I'm sorry?
That was Daniel's point, that.
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't,
that,
I was thinking at the
that
same
one
time.
Las Vegas will, make it so that, automatic weapon, is.
This is an incident-based, not a victim.
Correct, right. So it should not overwhelm it.
All
No,
right.
it's an incident-based.
Right.
It is.
This is
Right.
incident.
Just not percent of homicides.
It's percent of homicide
Incidents.
incidents.
Yeah.
Correct.
That's what it's actually
Okay.
So I've found two severe errors on my slide that I'm not clear in my language. That is a number one problem for me. Yeah, so this is an incident level analysis looking at the number of victims in each of the incidents. So those incidents should not overwhelm it. But it does bring up the point that there are limitations in the way, in the structure of the data collection and of themselves. So there are artifacts that you have to look out for that I don't think affect that many incidents. So I would have to say that that's not a huge consideration. But when you are looking at this type of information, you may want to account for it. So for instance, when I was talking about the 30 plus victims of the Virginia Tech shooting, those victims are arrayed across three different incident lines. And you have to, as the researcher, go in and pull those all into one incident record in order to look at the information this particular way. Because you can only have 10 victims for each case in the data collection. So you're capped at a certain point. That's across 4 because I believe 1 or 2 of the law enforcement officers were considered to be killed in a separate incident that occurred shortly before, I believe, the students on campus. So there are some considerations here that you have to look out for. And my understanding, or my recollection of the data also is that, for instance, none of the 9/11 victims are in the file because that would overwhelm for 1 year what you see for New York City. So, any other questions? So moving to information that we collect on the corrections side of the equation. So we just recently completed the 2016 survey of prison inmates. Used to have a different name, but it was still a survey of prison inmates. And we originally conducted, I believe it was the first iteration of this back in 1997. And then we had an update in 2004. And then for many years had a drought and were able to get back into the field in 2016. What happened in between was the Prison Rape Elimination Act. where we had to go into an amazingly large number of facilities and interview an amazingly large number of inmates. And so the burden for those efforts really overwhelmed some of our corrections collections, and hence the 12-year drought between the previous survey of prison inmates until now. So SPY is self-reported data that's collected through face-to-face interviews with a national sample of both state and federal prisoners. Collects a wide variety of information about the prison inmates themselves, the incident, the incident that they were in prison for, their background information about their drug use and mental health status, time in the facility, and trying to bound it by the number of months or years, et cetera, that they've been incarcerated. So we did collect a number of elements that were specific to firearms. In addition to whether a firearm was in the possession of the inmate at the time of the controlling offense and whether it was used, we also found out information about the type of firearm that was possessed or used, and then information about how they obtained that firearm. And also embedded into the survey instrument was self-report data on the criminal history of the offender, so asking them a bit about their criminal history background, involvement with the justice system. And then we also did a secondary collection to get electronic criminal history data collected through III. So what we found, and this report containing this information was released just earlier this year, if memory serves. About 21% of prisoners said that they possessed a gun during their offense, and about 13% of prisoners said that they actually showed, pointed, or discharged a firearm during their offense. And we're able to unpack that information a little bit more to see how those weapons were obtained. So only about 10% actually sort of legitimately, I guess, purchased the weapon through a typical retail or related type of source. About half of them indicated that they obtained the gun illegally, either through a type of black market or off the street, traded with a friend, or through a theft of a gun of some sort. We also were able to take a look at information about which types of offenders, so to speak, actually possessed or used a gun during the offense. And what you can see is that about 85% of homicide offenders who said they possessed a gun during their incident that got them into prison, about 85% of them actually used the gun during that incident, as opposed to 40% of property offenders and about 8% of drug offenders. So one of the pieces of information you can pull out is, did you have the gun, and then did you actually use it, which is something I don't believe that we had collected in previous versions, trying to understand what's essentially the conversion rate. Because when we look sort of broadly across the incident-based data that we collect on crime involving a firearm, we don't have that information. A lot of times we're asking the question, was a firearm present? But we're not able to get at, was it actually used or discharged beyond someone actually having a gunshot wound, which we know most people are pretty bad shots, and so that's not really a great indicator of whether the weapon was used in the commission of the offense. Yeah.
This sample was constructed as a representative sample of all prisoners in state or federal prison?
Yes.
So if people who use a gun get longer sentences, so this number is of current prisoners, which could be because the people are using guns, but it could be because people who use guns during their crime get much longer sentences. And so
Yeah, that's possible. So it's a stratified random sample. So I'm not going to know as much about the sampling strategy for this particular data collection as I would like to answer these questions, but I do know that it is stratified by offense type as well. So it's not just saying we're going into a facility and taking some random sample of facility within the facility. It's having an understanding of how the controlling offenses are arrayed within the facility, and then sampling within offense type.
So do you know if it's possible to back out the length of sentence in a way?
It is, so
Okay.
that isn't done here, but that information is collected.
see.
So you'll not only have the self-report criminal history data and the III data that would be connected to that to make comparisons across those two different sources of information on criminal history. You'd also have sentence length information specific to the controlling offense that got them into the facility in the first
So you
place.
could somehow back out
You could,
the
yes.
concentration of based on sentence length.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you have any issue with cross-contamination where an offender's in prison for a robbery that turned into a homicide, whether they're in multiple categories in the state?
I don't know that, but I can find that out for you. I can find that out. I don't know that off the top of my head, though. So I did not meet my goal, which was to actually get to the stuff that I've been doing for like the last 6 years, but I will.
Can I just
I will.
ask, how many more slides do you have?
Not that many. I
Yeah,
can
so-
honestly just sort of throw
And
in
the
what.
main objective is, for this is so that you guys know that these data sets
Yeah.
exist.
I apologize
and
for
share
not
that
paying
with
attention.
Your colleagues.
It's fine.
So
Thank you,
there's lots
Jim.
of questions you can ask about denominators and weighting.
Yeah, yeah.
But,
I will cede some of my discussion.
and I would, thank you.
Thank you, David.
Let's hear about more about the data.
Okay, okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Yes.
So I guess that fits within the implicit rule here. I wanted to know when you're going to release these data. Some of us are eager to get our hands on them.
Yes. No. So that is a critical question, right? Yeah, so one of the challenges that we're actually having in releasing our data sets is not anything internal. It has to do with the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data staff turnover. So all of the institutional knowledge that we've had for how we have to process and release the information is completely gone from NACGD right now. So we have a backlog of data sets that are waiting to be published. That's my way of punting the responsibility, not on purpose, but just sort of stating the facts. So I don't know for certain, but we're very hopeful that within, I would say, by the end of the year, I hope. So, yeah. So I will try to go a little bit more quickly because I want to make sure that Chief Lewin has enough time to speak to, and then we have a chance to talk. So let me just head on over to this. So these actually will go pretty quickly because the data are not national and because we're a federal statistical agency charged with releasing national data, we haven't published a lot on the NISS data. We are working toward publishing state-level analyses because we need to have a unit. We need to have some ability to generalize to some unit of government that people understand. So that's what we're working toward. That's one of our big challenges. So there's not a lot I'm going to be able to show you on the data side, but there's a lot I can talk about in terms of what's in the actual data collection. The way that I like to think about NISS is that it's essentially the police recorded crime equivalent of the Ncvs. The Ncvs collects information on crime that is not reported to the police, which is a critical component that we do not get here, of course. But the one additional benefit, if nothing else, to NISS is that you have an overwhelmingly large number of cases. So you're never going to have problems comparing categories, or almost never. I haven't run across it yet, anyway. So you get a lot of the same incident-based information that you'll get in the Ncvs. I believe that we had a pretty good standard to use at the time that the NISS standard was developed because the Ncvs was had already been developed and collected for a good decade by the time that this was implemented. So what this does is it allows us to look at, because we have such a large caseload, for better or for worse, in terms of police recorded crime, this allows us to look at demographic populations that we traditionally have a really hard time documenting empirical information about, like child victims, elderly victims. Those have been victims of rare but very serious offenses, such as violent sexual assault, robbery with a weapon resulting in major injury. Those are the kinds of subcategories that we can get down to with the NISS data collection. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what the FBI has been doing, but this is something that's been consuming my life for the better part of 6 years or so. The FBI is in the process of transitioning all of the uniform crime reporting data to the NISS standard. So as of January 2021, they are sunsetting the summary reporting system and will no longer accept those data from law enforcement agencies. This will be the standard for law enforcement crime reporting for the nation as of that date. Trying to get more of this information available across the nation. So just a little bit of blurb about that. We've been running this joint program with the FBI now for about 5 years. And our initial goal was to do this in a sample-based way. There had been a blueprint for how to grow the NISS data that had been developed in the mid-'80s. And so we said, why reinvent the wheel? A lot of really smart people came up with this blueprint, right? And so this was the format that we were going to use to try to get to a national estimate as all the other agencies, hopefully across the country, start reporting. So to fill that gap between now and when we have a census of data at some point in the future. Hopefully by 2021, that's the goal. We'll see how it goes. But right now there are about 6,800 agencies that report their data in this format. It does not array randomly across the country though. There are, I believe we are at 17 states that only accept NISS data. Only has a caveat around it. I'm happy to tell you all the crazy nuances that I've learned about this data collection over the years, but I will try to gloss over some of that now and answer those questions later. But about 17 states that only collect NISS data from their local agencies and only report those data to the FBI. We call those full reporter states. That's what we're using to generate these state level analyses. There are a number of other states. I don't have the map that I normally show here, but there are a smattering of other states that also are in the 80 to 95% reporting range, and then they drop off precipitously from there. So we are missing some big places, like California and Florida, and New York, but only for a little while. So we are making a lot of headway in terms of reporting. Did you have a question? Sorry.
I'm wondering are there privacy issues with the translation of the data into this format, or is it something that could be, I know it sounds crazy, like crowdsourced or somehow distributed as work in terms of past data?
I'm not sure I understand your question, I'm sorry. So
You're saying that basically all these states are switching to this new format. In terms of historic data from the past, that isn't even other format.
Sure.
Are there privacy issues around the translation of those data into the format?
The older data?
Yeah.
Probably not, because I don't think you can do it, because they're only
Just
summary counts.
Okay.
So the way that the data are collected under summary is, for instance, agency X right now just reports they had 15 homicides. But this data collection gets that information on all 15 homicides, all the victims, offenders,
I see,
theoretically.
okay.
Yeah, so you probably could take it and walk it back in some way, but it'd be a lot of work. And I know people have done that, but on a limited scale, I don't know how to do that across the country. So I'm gonna skip past some of this and just talk a little bit. So this isn't specific to homicide, or not homicide, excuse me, to firearm violence, but I wanted to just show you one of the strengths of this data is looking at measures of risk by crime type. So again, for violent sexual assault, we often run out of cases in a lot of the data collections that we have looking at that particular phenomenon. And again, for better or for worse, we don't have that problem with the NISS data. There are enough victims reported throughout the data to take a look at violent sexual assault disaggregated by the age of the victim and by various other characteristics. And the whole point of showing this information is not to say these are the specific numbers in these boxes, but to say when you're looking at violent sexual assault of children under the age of 12 and comparing them to teens between the ages of 12 and 17, you see that the risk changes across those age categories. And this is something, I've used the information to look at victims of elder abuse and how that changes from place to place and what the risks are in terms of victimization of older people, and you can do the same thing here. So kids are victimized by people they know in a household. Older teenagers, their victimization is now going to shift, their risk is going to shift, I should say, to outside the home, but still by people that they know, friends and acquaintances. we'd also look at this for various age breakouts among adults, and we see the same kinds of shifts and that things sort of move back into the home the older you get. This is horrible, and I apologize. It's horrible. I have no skills in this arena, but what I wanted to point out is that I'm looking here. This sort of dark gray piece here are stranger violence across by victim age, I should say, and you can obviously see far fewer victimizations perpetrated by a stranger against really young kids. It gets bigger in the middle, sort of. I don't know what's going on here again, but the point was to say, let's take a look at those stranger victimizations, and this is how the offense types array for just stranger violence in one city in 1 year. So you have the strength within this data to look at this kind of information at the local level like this. It's one of our few growing national sources of data that actually provide this type of information. And so when you unpack it, okay, let's look at when these robberies happen. So if you just lump everything together, you see a general category, maybe you're surprised to see a lot of robbery happens during the day, maybe you're not, in terms of, the transient populations coming in for work, et cetera. When you start to look at that by whether a gun was used or not, you do see very different patterns. And there are all sorts of things that you can layer on top of this. We're in the process right now of trying to use the same data, layering on information that we know from our law enforcement management and statistics, law enforcement management and administration survey of law enforcement agencies, trying to understand what policies and practices, et cetera, are going on within the local department, and looking at gun violence and at the local level across some of our largest agencies that are in the data collection right now. Trying to basically expand this kind of information. So just as a quick illustration, this is fairly rudimentary, but again, this is taking a look at the phenomenon of robbery and saying, okay, if I just took a state and I said, what's the robbery rate within the state across the years, you get some general information, is it sort of going up, going down, et cetera. But then you can start to unpack that by whether there was a weapon involved, a firearm involved in the incident, and you can look at the difference in the rates there. But then you can also break it out by county. So I picked Michigan because I grew up there. I knew the county seats in each of these 3 counties, and so I aggregated the data to take a look. And you start to see really different patterns. I think this is a little bit better illustration. So the state level rate is up at the top. The second one down is Washtenaw County, where the county seat is Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, really great, lovely little town, very safe place for the most part. You see a much smaller robbery rate overall, an armed robbery rate. And then you move to Genesee County, where the county seat is Flint. And obviously the rate is quite different. The circumstances in Flint compared to Ann Arbor in terms of poverty, housing, jobs, et cetera, very different. And then the third county there is Wayne County, where the county seat is Detroit. And again, you see some very big differences. There's a lot of other information in the data collection that can be layered on top here. And it has all the strengths of the supplementary homicide reports data, but on a much broader scale. And every year, I believe that we add annually more than, and this is not a national data collection yet, I believe annually we add over 5 million records of individual victims to this file. So it's very large, it's very robust, it has a lot of information that can be layered on top of it. We're barely hitting the tip of the iceberg with anything that we've done at this point. And a lot of researchers don't use this data set. Nobody really knows what it represents, so we're trying to get some information out there about how we plan to use the data, what we think is important in terms of key indicators. We're developing a national estimate program right now, working on how to best weight and impute the data to develop these national estimates. And we hope that over time, we can get lots of other people involved in doing this research. Not only the research that we as a federal statistical agency can't take on, but also things that teach us about what we can do with these data and what might be important to look at as a national level indicator, using the data as they are now at the subnational level. So that's it. Thank you for the opportunity.